a Kangaroo Fern production.
From Mentari Newsroom at redmentari.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Expert Interview, where we dive into the economic and political development shaping Australia's future. I'm your host, Miko Santos, and today we have a special episode analyzing the recently released 2025-2026 federal budget and, of course, the opposition response on that. To help us make sense of the economic implication and policy direction, I'm delighted to welcome to the show Professor Gigi Foster, a distinguished economist from the University of New South Wales. Professor Foster is known for her insightful analysis of economic policy, labor market, public finance. She publishes extensively on Australian economic issues and regular commentator on budget matters and fiscal policy. Professor Gigi Foster, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Miko. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here, Professor. Treasurer Chalmers described this as the budget that turning the corner together. From your perspective as an economist, is Australia actually turning any economic corners with this budget?
No, not really. I mean, this is a typical budget you'd expect in the lead up to an election, which, as you know, has just now been called for the 3rd of May. I think that short timeline is partly because the government is hoping that people continue to bear in mind the various handouts that the government is giving them in this budget, or at least seeming to give them, even though some of those handouts aren't going to be particularly large in value. But we do have, as you know, the continuation of the energy rebate. Some people think that's nice for their back pocket. We have the sort of increases in the threshold for the Medicare levy. We have a little bit of fiddling with the tax and income tax rates. So there's a few things that people can say, oh yeah, I benefit from that. And this is typical. This is the typical kind of Australian budget we've seen in the past many years, actually. It's not really addressing the structural problems with Australia's economy or society or health or education, the corruption. There's so many things that we actually do really need to address seriously, but that this budget is not tethering itself to. There's no even conversation in the budget papers about how the various provisions are addressing the most basic problems that we face at a structural level. And so, and when the language is used, like about productivity enhancement, it's tied to measures which are not broad across the economy and not deep enough to really impact things in the long run. So I do think this is, mainly driven by politics. And unfortunately, I think the Australian people will, in the main, swallow it down whole, because a lot of people don't really have the knowledge or economic literacy to be able to decipher what's really going on, and they don't really understand the inflationary influence that may be brought to bear by some of these policies, which, of course, is the last thing we want to be doing.
Thank you for that. So the government claims inflation is coming down faster than anticipated. Do you think their economic forecasts are realistic, or is there some election year optimism baked into these numbers?
Yeah, I mean, the going joke is that economists have predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, right? And I use that joke all the time. And I mean, I just don't put any any weight on these sorts of forecasts. You did, I don't know if your listeners listened to the actual budget speech, but Chalmers at the beginning was all optimism, hope, fluffy bunnies and unicorns, and it was mainly based on projections, not the realities that we're seeing. Now, it is true that there are some indicators that are showing inflation returning back down towards the target range, and that's, of course, welcome news. And I think that was sort of expected anyway. That's one of the reasons why the RBA lowered rates the last time that they met. There was kind of an expectation that we had hopefully turned the worst of the corner on inflation, but we still have major problems, and a lot of the problems are not to do with inflation. They're not to do with just the cash rate. They're not to do with just the monetary side of the economy, but they're about real problems we have: the productivity slump, the excess deaths, corporate tax evasion, as I say, corruption, rising wealth inequality is a huge one. The housing crisis, right? And the kinds of so-called solutions that you see in this budget to these problems are just tiny little band-aids. They're not. It's, I don't know, the responsibility for being true stewards of their society that politicians, I think, used to feel has just gotten up and ran away from a lot of our modern politicians, I feel. And so the real hard work for determining what kind of policies really would be good is done now by independent analysts in back rooms in think tanks and whatnot. And good luck if they ever get a conversation with a politician or a bureaucrat. So, it's a very disappointing budget from my perspective.
Thank you for that, Professor Forster. One thing that stuck on my head was the tax cut being offered by the government. They're saying every taxpayer will get a cut next year and the year after. How significant are this cut really for the average household?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some calculations. I haven't done them myself, but I've seen some by people I trust that indicate that this is, a cup of coffee a week or something like that. It's not particularly large. It's enough to be able to claim that there is a cut. And I have to say that just in principle, philosophically, I am in favor of cutting taxes on working people. I think that's a good idea. And so I'm not going to say no to this, but I think it's mainly implemented in order to have the political ability to say we've given a tax cut. Because remember, there's also at the same time bracket creep, which in an inflationary environment that we're still in, despite the fact that inflation's coming down, it's still a little higher than it should be. In an inflationary environment, bracket creep is going to just push people up into the higher brackets anyway. So even if a particular bracket gets a cut, if you go up into the next bracket, you might be getting a rise, right? So it's kind of a sleight of hand situation. So I don't think that's, and in any way, that's not where you are going to fix the problem of the receding tax base. It is true that the tax base has been receding over the last 10 or 15, 20 years, but that's not because people have been not paying enough income tax. It's because big, huge corporations and really wealthy people have been able to hide their profits and their wealth. That's why, right? So that's where the solution lies if we actually want to restore the tax base. And at the same time, I think we should be working on the expenditure side. I think there's a lot that the government has been spending on, which is just silly stuff. I mean, I could list a billion of them, but you probably don't. Your listeners aren't that interested. But there's definitely waste in the government, and it's our taxpayer dollar. So we are the ones who should have some oversight on that. So I've even proposed some more systemic reforms that would allow citizens, real citizens of Australia, to have direct oversight into who leads the public service. And those are the people who are making these big decisions about how much gets spent and how it gets spent. So, I think we should have basically a lot more direct democracy, a lot more direct citizen voice, rather than just being treated to a clown show every budget season and having to play favorites on who gets the.
That's a strong word, Professor Foster. Peter Dalton dismissed this tax cut as a cruel hoax and instead proposed having the fuel excise for 12 months. Which approach do you think would probably better cost of living relief?
Well, I definitely support the fuel excise tax cut, and I've talked about that in previous years. Actually, I think that's just an obvious no-brainer. We have so much energy in this country, actually, and so much potentially cheap energy. And I think one of the rationales for the fuel excise tax cut is that it's not just going to hit the consumers, the households, in the back pocket, but everyone in the economy, upstream and downstream, who needs fuel for transporting goods is going to feel the benefit of a fuel excise tax cut. And so that means that it's cheaper to bring your groceries from the wholesaler to the retailer, or from the farm to the wholesaler, and everything else that you buy, right, is going to be cheaper to transport it. And so I think that's a major thing, and it's not inflationary because it's actually bringing prices down for people, right? So it's a non-inflationary way to ease the cost of living and also have spillover effects on other parts of the economy that hopefully will bring prices down elsewhere as well, not just at the pump. So I've been in favor of that for years, and I'm glad that at least somebody's picking up on that. That's a good thing.
Let's talk about the budget. Still in the budget, mentioned that the global economic growth is expected to be as its slowest since 1990s. How vulnerable is Australia to these international headwinds?
Yeah, look, everyone will be to some extent affected by that. I think, as you know, our biggest trading partner is China on a lot of the big things that matter, like iron ore and whatnot. So the main thing that I looked at to determine how well we're going to do is, well, what's the price of iron ore? I mean, that's just like the main indicator of Australia's economic health, right? And so, if, for example, the Chinese real estate market starts to go back down again, we were having some serious issues with that last year, as you may recall. If there's a lot of headwind in that particular sector, then that will more meaningfully impact Australia than, for example, the Trump tariffs on our steel, which are really only going to hit a small fraction of the exports that we send to anybody. Because we just don't do that much trade and we don't sell that much steel to the US. In fact, we buy a lot of the US stuff and don't sell them as much. So, I think it depends on the sector. Australia is very, very fortunate. I mean, we have, known as a lucky country. We genuinely are, because we have so many natural resources. We can, buy a lot of stuff that we make. Like we can just dig it up and then we can buy it, or we can grow it and then we can buy it. So we don't have to necessarily be as dependent as some other countries do on other primary producers. Right. And so I think where we could really take a leaf out of Trump's book, honestly, not that I agree with everything he's doing. One thing I think that's good would be to focus a little more on our intermediate industries rather than just the primary industries, and not for any, philosophical reason necessarily, but just that we know that the Dutch disease is a danger. When you are a natural resource based economy, you have this problem that you basically are too dependent on that one sector, and that makes other areas of your economy vulnerable, and that's why we're so vulnerable on the iron ore price. So if we had a little more diversification, that would be really good. And I'd like to see a little more skill in Australia, required skill, rather than just a skill at serving a coffee or being an accountant. How about skill at actually making something? So I think, for kind of broader social reasons, and because of the Dutch disease problem, I'd like to see a bit more emphasis on, the development of some industries here. That would be really nice.
Thank you so much for that. Let's talk about energy policy. Professor Foster, the government is offering more rebates while Peter Dutton, is proposing a national gas plan with East Coast gas reservation. Which approach makes more economic sense to you?
Well, Dutton's plan, because we have a huge amount of gas, right? Our gas reserves per capita are something like, I don't know, number 4 or 5 in the world, right? Per capita. So that's huge. It's a huge advantage. And yet what we've been subjected to over the last couple of years, at least, is this nonsense fiction that we have these really, really high energy prices because Russia invaded Ukraine or something. And, we have all these international factors that are proving headwinds. And, that in fact, if we switch to so-called green energy sources, that the prices of energy are going to come down for us. That's just not true. I mean, it's just economically false. And so that, I love the environment and I want to save the environment, and that's not how you do it, right? So I just think it's a completely benighted, these sort of green energy subsidies, the green hydrogen stuff and the green metals, all this stuff. It's way oversold. Markets aren't ready yet to make transition to those places, to those kinds of technologies. And if they were, they would be doing it. And they will, when they do, they will only really penetrate to a certain extent in sectors. We're never going to replace all of the fossil fuel based energy production and just general, support of the economy that's presently done by fossil fuels with these, with wind and solar and stuff like that. It's just not going to happen. We can't do it. So I think people just really have to recognize the folly of that and how much money is being burnt on that could otherwise be used to actually help the environment, actually clean up our water, clean up our air, help our animals and our plants, clean up the oceans, right? There are things we would really like to do. I'd like to see more of, but instead we burn money on senseless, uneconomic projects. So yeah, I think the gas liberation policy is a much more sane policy. It's better for Australian consumers, and it's better in the long run for
Thank you.
our
I got
environment
an
as well.
additional question in relation with that. Doughton proposed defunding the Environmental Defender's Office and fast-tracking gas project. What will be the economic trade-off of prioritizing resources development over environmental consideration?
Well, I actually think that's a false dichotomy. So, what you see if you look around the world is that places that take the best care of their environments are the richest. They're the richest. How do you get rich? You use cheap, dense energy. Yeah. That's basically been the story of human development. It's gone from burning manure, like cow pats, to burning something pretty clean, like natural gas, or even nuclear. And so as you get sort of along that trajectory, you start to clean up your environment. Why? Because you have the luxury of being able to pay more to do that. You care about it more, you're able to do it more. So you see the worst environmental situations and contexts in the places that are poorest in this world. So when you keep your population rich and getting richer, what you're doing indirectly is providing for the environment a larger and larger pool of resources that can be used to protect it. And that is what we see over and over again. Everybody loves Mother Earth. We all love Mother Earth. We want to protect her. We want to make sure that humans are not unsustainably ravaging Mother Earth. Where is she ravaged the most? In poor countries. So, I mean, that's just the logic. So you don't sort of, often, I don't like to see people, sort of, I guess, assuming that there's a trade-off between economic development on the one hand and protecting the environment on the other. They actually go hand in hand, and they're positively
So,
correlated.
Doton proposing nuclear power as part of energy mix and claiming it would be 44 cheaper than Labor's plan. From your economic standpoint,
Well, I mean, I basically look overseas to see, what has been done. And if I look at France, France has been pretty much immune from all of the energy wars in Europe. Why? Because they've got a huge amount of nuclear energy and they've had it for decades, right? They know how to do it. So if I were, in charge of energy policy, which I'm not, but if I were, I would first of all not want to close off any potential technology. Any technology should be considered, yeah. And then I would want to look very carefully at the economics of nuclear power. I'd want to bring over some French engineers and I'd want to have them assess our situation here, including how long are the distribution networks and, the topology and everything that's relevant to setting up nuclear reactors. I'd want to get some advice. I'd basically commission a report from French nuclear engineers. And then I'd make a decision, right? I mean, I don't know enough about it right now because it's not my area, but that's the obvious path to take, I think, in terms of trying to solve that problem. And like I said, I don't see any reason we should completely eliminate from consideration any possible means of generating energy.
I'm just curious, Professor Foster, about your take on the government Medicare investment, described as the single largest commitment to Medicare since its creation. Is this addressing the fundamental challenges in our health system?
Well, no. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear me say that. I've written elsewhere about the structural problems in the Western health system, so people can read about that if they want to look up the blog that I wrote, I think last year maybe, for Brownstone Institute. It's called "Is There a Cure for the Western Public Health Catastrophe?" Essentially, the Medicare investment is wise in the short run because people in Australia are sicker and they're dying more than they were pre-COVID, which doesn't really make sense if you look at how much we are paying for so-called health. So the cost, the outflow, from taxpayer dollars towards what is called health, the health department, has been growing and growing and growing, and the returns that we get for that investment have not been commensurate. And so to me, that tells me that the policy realm of health is one where we have a lot of failure, and we need to really think about what we're doing there. Are we really keeping people healthy, or are we just promoting the uptake of various things that have a label of health but aren't actually keeping people healthy, and instead are maybe pursuing another agenda or another objective, like basically making profit, which is of course natural. Companies want to make profit. Pharmaceutical companies are no exception. So I think I do support one of the kind of emphases in the budget, which is the emphasis on GPs, because general practitioners' advice and support are actually inputs to health around the world. That's one of the best places you can get health, because they sort of just take care of all the everyday issues that people have. You're not likely to pick up a really nasty like MRSA bug or something at the GP's office like you might at the hospital. And the GP can do an awful lot of things, minor injuries and dispensing cheap, effective medicines and giving you general lifestyle advice. There's a lot that can happen at the GP's office. And in fact, I think we need more of that kind of style of healthcare where you have community-based nurses and advisors who can more easily and in like a less costly way dispense advice about actual health, not just here's the latest Me Too drug which costs a bomb and I can sell this for you and then you'll be magically better, even though there's probably 17 side effects, right? So I think we need a total overhaul in the health system, but I do support the incentives for more doctors to become GPs that we see in this budget and the additional support for people seeing their GPs.
Thank you for that. Earlier, you mentioned about housing crisis. We all know that housing crisis continue to be the major issues in Australia, and the government aims to build 1.2 million new homes before the end of the decade. But the opposition wants to cut migration by 25%. How would you assess this different approach?
Well, I mean, I think we need to do both. I think that the migration question is delicate because there are some kinds of migration that obviously help Australia. I mean, I think you're probably an immigrant. I'm an immigrant. I like to think that, we're helping the country by having this conversation even and trying to educate people about what's happening in their country. But there's a huge amount of immigration that is, I think, more exploitative of Australia's resources than actually investing in it. And so I think that's the target that I would have if I were thinking about how to take the pressure off of some of our infrastructure that is due to immigration. It would be like the student immigration, for example. I think we have way too many people coming in to the university sector to get educated here and then just, going back home, or, maybe they settle here, but not for very long or whatnot. So they're not really planning to come and invest and really build the country. So I do think that is something we should look at. I also think that, yes, we should be prepared to build some more public housing. I don't like the idea of the government co-owning your house with you. I don't think that's a great way to go. But I actually think if we really wanted to address the inequality in the housing market, which is so evident, right? If you happen to be born in a family that happened to buy in, the perfect neighborhood in 1972, then today you have no housing problem. But if you weren't in that family, you have a massive problem. So there's this kind of dual, market. Some people are like, there's no problem. I own lots of, property and it's great. Well, you were born into it probably, or, got money that came from property and then you were able to buy into it. But then another chunk of our population is just thinking, I'm never going to be able to own a home, or not until I'm 50 years old. So if you really wanted to address that, one way to do it is to give people, earning people, working people, more of their money earlier in their lives so that they actually can decide for themselves whether they want to save for a down payment on a house, let's say, or do something else. So the superannuation system is what I'm thinking of as a target there, because super is compulsory and very high as a fraction of your wage here in Australia, and you can't touch it. There's a lot of rules around it, right? You can't borrow from it unless the government happens to, deign to give you, to bless you and say, yes, you may take a withdrawal this year because of COVID or something. Otherwise, you basically have to not touch it. But it is money that the employer that you have is contributing on your behalf. So it's kind of your money, right? It'll eventually be your money. So why not give more control over that to people, working people? I also actually support inheritance taxes above a certain amount because, and including housing wealth, because exactly of this, there's just not enough churn in the housing market between the people who are, old moneyed versus the people who are just up and coming. And just can't crack into the market. So if you forced some sales through having an inheritance tax on, say, assets passed down more than, say, 2 million or something, then I think that would actually help to release some of that housing stock. And there are other policies too, like increasing incentives to have higher occupancy rates. Because at the moment, there's a lot of vacancy in our big cities. If you go around in the evening, you see a lot of dark apartments and houses too that are just not developed, not being used, people rattling around in a 5-bedroom home when there's only 2 of them. So we need to have more incentives to actually use the housing stock that we presently have, get people into the buildings, and that can be a whole creative area of policy design.
The budget includes measures for a cheap medicine and reducing student loan or debt. Are these targeted properly to address inequality, or they more about just winning votes?
There's certainly going to be vote winners. We know that. I don't like the HEX one mainly because I find it to be unfair. I mean, you happen to have a hex debt, and so it happens to have 20% of it erased. I mean, just those people. What about the people who just last year finished paying off their debt, right? Or what about the people now who are accumulating it? Are they going to get that, right? It's very distortionary and unfair. So I don't like that. And in terms of the prescription medicine costs, I think a lot of prescription medicines are probably not the best way to treat the problem that the person has. A lot of the time it's more holistic. So again, I think we need to have a more serious talk about restructuring the medical system. But a lot of the older people who will get a lot of prescriptions will be under stress financially, more so than maybe other segments of the population. So if prescription medicine costs are a major problem, then sure, that's a nice idea to give that to them. So again, in the short run, I can see the logic, but I think it's just emblematic of a bigger problem, which is we rely too much on prescription medicines and not enough on actually bolstering our own natural healing and immune systems, and emphasizing things like good diet, good sleep, drinking a lot of water and exercise and getting sunlight and things like that, which can actually prevent us from having to use quite a lot of the prescriptions we presently fill.
Yeah, that's right. So the budget also mentioned I think the deficit will hit 950 billion this financial year, but Dalton claimed labor will reach $1 trillion. How concerned should we be about these numbers?
I mean, those are numbers floating in space for most of your listeners, right? They seem really big, right? And sure they are. The main problem with government debt is that having to repay it crowds out other expenditure. So when you have a large amount of repayment obligation in a given year, those dollars you use to repay are dollars you're not spending on other things that we want, right? Whether that's infrastructure or education or actual health or whatever it is, environmental stewardship, something. So that's the core problem. And I don't really mind if we invest government money and accumulate a deficit for doing so, as long as those investments are made in areas that are going to actually build Australia's productivity and grow our economy and make us more able to pay off the debt later without having that crowd out happen, right? But one of the reasons that I was so against what happened during COVID was that I saw what we were doing was accumulating debt for the purpose of just treading water. There was no growth related or productivity related investment happening. All that was happening was the government was staunching a self-inflicted wound, the wound of lockdowns, by these massive fiscal expenditures, which were like job seeker or job keeper or whatever it was called, right? That sort of policy where you're just bleeding money in order not to grow your economy, but just to stay where you are, that is going to lead later on to having to repay that debt out of money that doesn't grow on trees. And you haven't generated the growth to make that debt be able to be repaid without crowding out other expenses. So that's the problem. So we'll all be a little bit less well off because of the debt that we accumulated in COVID and the debt that we're continuing to experience, except to the extent that what we're spending on is actually leading to a stronger, healthier, more rich nation in the future.
I also noticed, Professor Foster, both sides are talking about defense spending increase, with the treasurer saying it will grow beyond 2.3% of GDP. In economic terms, what are the implications of this increased defense focus?
Well, I mean, I think that's unfortunately a reflection of the belligerent times that we now live in, uncertain and somewhat more belligerent than when I was growing up, certainly. We just had China's Navy going around Australia, right? And nobody really moved a muscle. We're worried that maybe Trump's America might not come to our aid as quickly, or there might be some disruption in the diplomatic ties between our countries now, and so we're a little more nervous about that. So you can kind of understand where the increased desire to bolster our own defenses is coming from. I mean, I'm a very peace-loving person. I don't love that idea, but I also see the political reality on the ground, which is that we are a Western nation in the middle of Asia, and we've got a really, really big, powerful country to our north that doesn't, they trade with us, thank goodness, and we got to keep that going because that makes them less likely to want to kill us. But they're still there, and in case somebody wanted to push us around, they probably could pretty easily. So, I mean, I do think our defense forces are probably in need of some reorientation towards actual defensive capabilities. So it's not just a performative kind of thing anymore. I think there needs to be a bit of investment in really knowing how to ward off an adversarial attack if necessary. So I don't want to say I don't support it, but it's unfortunate, and I certainly would hope that diplomacy and trade would keep the threat of war at bay for as long as possible.
Thank you for that. So Dalton mentioning as well on his speech that abolishing the non-compete clause for most worker, the government also reforming them. What economic effect might these changes have on, say, on the labor market?
Yeah. So the argument is that this is going to increase productivity because of the increase in competition that it will bring about. So if you imagine somebody working for a big company who has some insider knowledge and then they quit and they'd like to go out on their own shingle and be a competitor to their old boss, right? The non-compete clause meant that they couldn't really do that as easily. So the idea is if we remove these clauses, they'll be able to go into business more quickly and maybe provide some competition, which would then bring down the prices in that sector to the clients. And so that would increase the productivity, measured productivity that we're producing in that sector. It may happen a bit, I guess, but I don't know. It seems to me that that's kind of it's a long shot that's really the reason why our productivity has been so sluggish for so long. Just non-compete clauses. I mean, really, we have non-compete clauses in the U.S. too, and somehow we haven't had the long productivity slump that you've seen in Australia. I used to work in New York City in a consulting firm where the non-compete clauses were everywhere, and there were kind of ways to get around them sometimes, and they were always time limited, so it wasn't like you could never open another company, right? So I kind of think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup. The way it's being presented is as a major productivity booster, but I don't really anticipate that it's going to boost productivity that much.
Thank you so much for that. Finally, looking at the both budget and the reply, which policy do you think would most benefit Australia's long-term economic resilience?
Well, I don't really like either of the major parties, but if I had to pick one, I'd go with Dutton's. Honestly, what I like most that I see these days, in terms of policies, is the policy platform that an independent person put out. I think it's the People's First policy or something. There's a number of independents, and I think people should really look at what they're offering to get a wider idea of the kind of policies that are possible. I mean, I don't endorse any particular politician, but I do think that, you need to, as an Australian voter, if you really care about this country, you need to expand your view of what policies could be implemented, how seriously politicians could take the rebuilding of this country back to strength and health.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Gigi Foster of the School of Economics at University of New South Wales. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. This is another episode of the Expert Interview at redmencarry.com. See you again next week for another episode. Thank you so much.